Welcome to the Sprout Out Loud podcast. I'm your host, Allie McGowan, a registered dietitian on a mission to help others navigate confusing nutrition information. Each week, we'll explore practical strategies for improving metabolic health and building lifestyle habits that support lasting change. My goal is to equip you with the tools and insights to take control of your health and make informed choices that work for you. Welcome to the 10th ever episode of the Sprout Out Loud podcast. Today's episode is going to be short and sweet, or at least that's my plan for today's episode. But I'm going to be talking all about supplements versus real food. Should we choose supplements or should we choose real food to sort of meet our nutrient needs? I'm going to be focusing mostly on fiber supplements and protein supplements because these are the two biggest supplements that I get asked about in my one-to-one visits or from other people who are sort of interested in what's the best approach to prioritize these specific nutrients. There's definitely growing interest in supplements, but I also feel like with that comes a lot of growing confusion. It feels like there is a supplement out there for pretty much everything nowadays, and we're also seeing certain nutrients like more fiber or more protein being added to food products. So I talked last week all about protein and reference some products that we're seeing protein being added to. So protein bars, protein shakes, those are our standard that I feel like have been around for decades now. But we're also seeing things like protein chips, protein bagels. We're seeing yogurt with extra protein in them, even things like protein crackers. And we also have other supplements that are high in fiber that people may sort of be using to replace things like fruits or vegetables or getting that fiber from real food. And two of the products I would say I'm seeing this the most in are things like these prebiotic or probiotic sodas, or even more of these healthier cereals that have things like chicory root fiber added to them. And I want to stop here and just say that if you enjoy these foods, the intent is not to encourage you to eliminate them, but rather to think about the protein or the fiber that we get from these foods as maybe bonus or in addition to getting protein and fiber from more of these whole food sources. So if you're like, you know what, Allie, my Quest protein chips just add the perfect crunch to my lunch, I'm going to say that's awesome. You should keep them in there if they're serving you. But can we, instead of relying on those protein chips as being your main protein source, can we prioritize getting protein from more of these whole foods and think about the protein that comes from those chips as bonus? Personally, I love a good Olipop or one of those prebiotic sodas or probiotic sodas on occasion, but I wouldn't take those as replacement from getting fiber from whole foods like fruits, veggies, and starchy carbs. So again, the intent is not to demonize any one of these products. If it fits into your day and your life and you really enjoy these products and it aligns with your health goals, amazing. But if you find that, wow, I'm really relying heavily on something like these food products like this Olipop soda or these protein chips to get in enough protein and fiber, the question would be, okay, could we again consider those to be bonus opportunities, but focus more on getting protein and fiber from these whole food sources instead? Before we get started, just a quick reminder, the information shared on the Sprout Out Loud podcast is for educational purposes only and is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice. Always consult with your healthcare provider before making changes to your diet or lifestyle. So today we're going to be talking about this concept called the food matrix, which basically just describes the physical and chemical structure of food. In other words, how food is packaged naturally and how that natural packaging sort of impacts how we access the nutrients in those foods, plus how that may impact things like how full we feel after we eat, how satisfied we feel after we eat, how that may impact things like our blood sugar, even our gut health, and how those components actually have an impact on our overall health. Big disclaimer here, I am not anti-supplements, but I am pro food first, and I do believe that supplements can absolutely fit into someone's nutrition plan or approach to meeting their nutrient needs. But we do need to consider the fact that if we are sort of reverting to supplements to meet all of our nutrient needs, we are going to be missing out on a lot of really great properties of foods that, again, can help us to feel more satisfied, help us to regulate our blood sugar, and just overall improve the quality of the foods that we eat or the quality of our dietary pattern. So maybe you've had this experience before where you've been on the go, or maybe your schedule just didn't lend to sitting down and having a meal. And maybe we opted for something like a protein bar or a protein shake instead of a whole food source of protein. You may have noticed that that food didn't hold you over, I guess, as much as you would have anticipated compared to if we were to get that same amount of protein from food in its unprocessed form. So 20 grams of protein from a protein bar is gonna look and feel differently than 20 grams of protein from something like chicken breast. And that's gonna be due to a couple of different factors. Again, that's gonna be due to this concept of the food matrix. So the food matrix describes how whole foods have structure. So they have texture, they have fiber, they have water, they have these naturally occurring compounds that sort of work together in ways that supplements may not be able to replicate. And this structure can actually change how our body digests, absorbs, and responds to nutrients. So the first term we're going to talk about is this term called bioavailability. And this basically describes how much of a nutrient that your body can actually absorb and use from food. So when we focus on whole foods, that's actually going to impact the bioavailability of nutrients in those foods, because the structure and the composition of the food will affect how nutrients are released during digestion. So for example, there are certain compounds in whole grains, let's say, that can actually slow down or limit the release of nutrients. And this is going to affect how much of those nutrients can actually be absorbed. When we chew those foods or cook those foods, that's actually going to liberate or release some of the nutrients from that food so that we can absorb them. So again, when we get foods in their whole form, that's going to sort of impact how available the nutrients in those foods are to the body. But it's also going to impact other things like fullness, blood sugar, and even gut health. So if we think about, again, going back to that example of like a chicken breast versus a protein bar, that chicken breast is going to require more cutting, more chewing, and simply just like more time to break down compared to that protein bar. Typically, when a food is more processed or more broken down, we're actually going to absorb more calories and more fats from those foods. So this is where the whole calories in versus calories out conversation can get a little bit nuanced, because for weight loss, we do need to be in a calorie deficit. However, the body might not absorb the same amount of calories from a 100 calorie serving of fresh raw apple compared to 100 calories of apple juice. That apple juice, because that has been slightly more processed, those then that food has been broken down, the body may actually absorb more calories from that apple juice compared to that fresh raw apple. In addition, that apple juice is going to be much more quickly digested and quickly absorbed by the body because we've sort of removed that fiber component that was in the whole, fresh, raw apple. And that fiber is actually going to have a really big impact on slowing down how quickly we digest that food and how quickly our blood sugar rises. In some cases, this could be good. If you needed a really quick hit of energy, let's say maybe you are running a marathon or you are doing some sort of event where you need that quick, really easy to digest fuel, that would be a great choice. But if you are just sitting at your desk or you don't need that fuel really quickly available to you, well, then those quick to digest foods may have a really unfavorable effect on your blood sugar that can lead to these sort of blood sugar spikes and dips. And I've talked about these blood sugar dips in previous episodes. But essentially, when our blood sugar dips, the body is going to want to bring that blood sugar back up to a normal level. And one of the ways that it's going to do that is by maybe having us feeling fatigued. Maybe we suddenly have sugar or carb cravings. And that's the body's way of sending a signal that says, hey, we need energy. Let's maybe opt for something sugary or starchy to bring that blood sugar back up. And I see that a lot in how cravings manifest for some people. If we take a look at their day, what they're eating, these blood sugar dips are typically the root cause of someone's cravings. So again, how a food is processed or packaged can affect how quickly it digests. In some cases, a quicker to digest food is good. It might be what we want. In other cases, it might not be what we want. So I think just understanding that the more processed a food is, the quicker to digest it is really just the take-home message there. The other thing to consider about more of these whole foods is that chewing actually is going to trigger certain hormones that signal to the body that, hey, we're full. So specifically, there's the hormone GLP-1. You've probably heard of these GLP-1 agonists or these GLP-1 drugs like Ozempic, Wegovy, Zepbound, Mounjaro. The body naturally produces this hormone GLP-1 that sort of says, hey, we've eaten and hey, we're full. One of the ways it's actually going to do that is through chewing. Now, the amount of GLP-1 hormone that you create in your body is not going to be nearly as strong as the amount of GLP-1 that you would get from any one of these drugs. But if we are not chewing our foods, whether because we're drinking them or maybe the food is just a little bit more processed, so it even requires less chewing, the less we're going to sort of trigger those fullness hormones. And those hormones do affect the gut and the brain. So it's not just like, oh, the physical feeling of fullness in my stomach or my abdomen, like getting that distension. It's also mentally how satisfied or how full you feel. And then as it relates to things like gut health, especially when we think about more of these fiber-rich foods, so these would be things like fruits, vegetables, including non-starchy veggies and starchy veggies like potatoes, squash, beets, also things like whole grains, beans, lentils, legumes, nuts and seeds, so on and so forth. These whole foods are really going to help to feed that gut bacteria and again, provide the fuel for our good gut bacteria to sort of like thrive. That's going to be more effective than if we got fiber from powders or supplements. So something like a green supplement, even if we are getting vitamins and minerals from those green supplements, whether it's like a fruit and veggie supplement or an athletic greens, we are going to be missing out on that fiber. And we really know that that fiber is super important for supporting that good gut health. The other thing to think about is when we choose more of these whole foods, they're going to take up more space on our plate. And so 25 grams of fiber from fruits, veggies, again, whole grains, nuts and seeds, if we were to put all of that on your plate, that would take up like multiple plates. And that is going to, again, lend to more of this physical satisfaction because it's actually going to take up more space in our belly and in our stomach. And that is going to sort of lend to this abdominal distension or this gastric stretch, as we call it, that also sends a signal to the brain that says that we're full. But if we think about like the actual act of eating these foods, again, this is going to require us to sort of maybe, hopefully, sit down, cut and chew our food. But it's also going to be potentially more visually satisfying if we see that we have all of this food to eat versus, again, if we were to get maybe that same amount of fiber. I don't know how you would even get 25 grams of fiber in a supplement. I feel like most don't provide that much, but just this is maybe an extreme example. But if we were to get all of that fiber in a supplement form, whether it's like a powder or a pill, that is not going to have that same effect on our physical or mental satisfaction or fullness nearly as much as if we were to get that fiber from those whole food sources. So similar to fiber, we do know that as it relates to protein, more of these whole protein foods come packaged naturally with things like vitamins and minerals and healthy fats. So for example, when we get protein from something like red meat, we're also getting the iron in that red meat. Same thing with fatty fish. When we get protein from that fatty fish, we're also getting the omega-3 fatty acids that are in that fatty fish. So this is just helping to provide like a nice complete nutrient package. And oftentimes these nutrients really work synergistically to sort of help increase the absorption of the other nutrient. So it's not just about, okay, I'm getting these nutrients, whether it's packaged in a whole food or isolated. It's also about how these nutrients sort of like interact and what effect that has on the body. Another thing to consider about these whole food sources of protein, because they're slower to digest, that's actually going to lead to a steadier release of amino acids into the bloodstream. And I've talked previously about how amino acids are basically just the building blocks of proteins. And so if you're someone who has muscle building goals, we know that if we're sort of getting that steadier release of amino acids, that can actually support the muscle building process, aka muscle protein synthesis. That is not to say that there's not a time and place for protein supplements. I think for some people, if you have a really busy morning, if you're someone who works out in the morning and you want to prioritize getting in enough protein after your workout, but you just don't have that hunger in place, then again, maybe this is where we would want to have an easier to digest protein source. Going back to that blood sugar conversation as well, these more whole food sources of protein are going to be slower to digest, and that is going to slow down how quickly our entire meal digests. So if you have a meal that has carbs, that protein is going to sort of slow down how quickly those carbs are broken down. And again, that's going to slow down how quickly our blood sugar rises and falls. So we want for our blood sugar to sort of like rise and fall, relatively slowly over an extended period of time. So think like a soft sloping hill instead of having our blood sugar sort of rise and fall really quickly. Think like, a really steep mountain with a pretty dramatic drop off. And so when we have these things like protein and fiber, both of those things are really going to slow down how quickly we digest that meal and how quickly that blood sugar rises and falls after we eat. That's going to affect things like our energy levels, our hormones. If our blood sugar is chronically like up and down, that's going to lend to more release of that stress hormone cortisol, and that's going to have a number of implications. But it's going to just help you feel a little bit more steady throughout the day. Maybe you have more energy or steadier energy. Maybe you're experiencing fewer cravings, fewer mood swings. Maybe you're better able to focus throughout the day. And that may impact your food choices. So if all of those things are happening, maybe we don't need a second or a third coffee. Maybe we don't have that like really intense sugar craving at 3 p.m. or after dinner because we have sort of been proactively keeping that blood sugar stable. So I sort of touched on this very briefly, but we also know that the way that these nutrients are packaged together can actually impact how they affect the body. So a great example of this is yogurt, right? So yogurt is an animal-based food, and because it's coming from an animal source, it's going to provide some of that saturated fat. But we know that actually the saturated fat that is packaged in that yogurt doesn't impact our LDL cholesterol or our like poor or bad cholesterol in the same way that we might expect it to. This is due to a couple of different factors, but for example, yogurt is also going to provide things like vitamin K2, which supports heart health. Some of the milk components in yogurt may also block cholesterol absorption. And then we're also getting other benefits like probiotics from that yogurt, which may also impact how we sort of process saturated fat in that food. So if we were to actually like isolate that saturated fat out of that yogurt, that may have a different effect than when that saturated fat is sort of like naturally occurring. And that's true for a lot of different foods. Not that I will touch on that in depth today, but just sort of reiterating that, okay, when we get these nutrients packaged naturally in food, they may have a different effect on the body than if we were to sort of like isolate them out. So to sort of tie this into supplements, I would say that supplements are tools for us to use. I think in most cases, we always want to focus on getting our nutrients from food first as often as possible. Again, if you're someone who is recovering from illness or appetite loss, or if you have a chronic condition that maybe is reducing your appetite, we may want to opt for more of those supplements or even more of those, more processed versions of these foods to sort of work with that limited appetite. But if we're someone who has a normal level of appetite, I think doing our best to get that protein and fiber specifically, that's really what I'm focused on today, from these whole food sources is going to, again, have a really beneficial effect on that physical satisfaction, that mental satisfaction, that blood sugar response, our gut health and our gut bacteria. And we know that those things can really impact our metabolic health and our hormone health in general. Another great application of supplements, if you're someone who just totally loses their appetite when you're stressed, or if I am always so busy in the morning. My mornings are crazy. I have to be out the door. Like, I would love to be able to sit down and have a breakfast, but it's just not going to happen. I would say that's a great use of a supplement. We can also use supplements in conjunction with whole foods as well. So taking something like a protein powder and pairing that with maybe fresh or frozen fruits and vegetables and nut butters or nuts and seeds. Even in that instance, I would say that we're still prioritizing that real food, right? So the supplement or the protein supplement is a tool, but we're still getting that good mix of whole food sources in that meal. Another thing that I see work for a lot of people is if they're having something like a pre-made protein shake to sort of get that protein in that way, pairing that with something like a piece of fruit or a small serving of nuts or seeds. Again, we're going to get fiber from those foods. That is going to help to slow down how quickly that meal digests. That's going to lend to having some of that physical and mental satisfaction. If you're someone who's like, maybe I have a normal appetite, but I'm leveraging the supplement for the sake of, minimizing how much time I'm spending eating, or maybe I'm having this food during my commute or what have you. So the intent is not to be quote unquote perfect with our food at all. But if you are sort of walking through your day and you're feeling like, man, I'm just never satisfied, I'm just always hungry, this could be a good opportunity to just take a look at your plate. Are we getting more supplements in our day, or are we getting more of those whole food sources? If you notice, okay, I'm having like a protein shake and a protein bar and a fiber gummy, but I'm not really getting in enough of those fruits or vegetables or other fiber sources, or I actually do have time for more of a meal here. Playing around with how satisfied you feel after maybe incorporating more of those whole food sources could have a pretty big impact on, again, how satisfied you feel and for how long you feel satisfied. There's nothing more frustrating than eating and then being hungry shortly after. It can just be super disruptive, and it can just sort of like keep food on our brain. So yeah, I think at your next meal, asking yourself, like, does this include something I can chew? Does this include something colorful? That's typically going to lend to maybe like those fruits or those veggies or those fiber-rich carbs, and just, being curious about your plate. So again, the intent is to aim for more of these whole foods most of the time. Consider those supplements, whether it's a protein supplement or a fiber supplement. Again, I'm not talking about other supplements today, but really focusing on supplements that we might leverage to replace food. Asking ourselves, could we make improvements there? As a reminder, if you have a request for a future episode, you can fill out the topic request form in my show notes. If you have feedback on the podcast, you're welcome to share that feedback there as well. Please feel free to leave a rating and review. I find all that information to be very helpful. And then you can find me on Instagram. My handle is at sproutoutloud, SPROUTOUTLOUD. That's one word. And online, my website is sproutoutloud.com. All right, thanks for listening.